Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. Work had been suffocating, my phone never stopped buzzing, and I couldn't remember the last time I had an actual conversation that wasn't work-related. I needed space, just a few days away from my apartment, away from deadlines, away from people in general. The listing was exactly what I was looking for: a secluded guest house on the edge of a small town, tucked between a row of evergreens, promising peace, privacy, and the perfect weekend getaway. The photos showed a cozy one-bedroom cabin, all modern furnishings and soft, warm lighting. It looked clean, well-kept, and most importantly, had a perfect 5-star rating. The host, Daniel, had over 100 positive reviews. Guests described him as friendly but hands-off, the type who gave you your space but was always available if you needed anything. It sounded ideal. I booked it for 3 nights. I should have done more research. I arrived just after sunset on Friday. The drive had been longer than expected, winding roads through patches of dense forest. The last 30 minutes completely dark aside from my headlights cutting through the trees. The place was even more remote than I'd realized. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky was deep indigo, the air cool against my skin. The house itself was exactly like the pictures: a sleek, modern guest house, tucked behind the main property. A row of porch lights cast a warm glow across the front steps, making the place look inviting. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, taking a deep breath of fresh, pine-scented air. For a moment I felt a sense of relief. No honking, no notifications, no city noise. Just quiet. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the front door, where a keypad lock blinked red. I checked my email for the entry code, typed it in, and heard the soft click of the deadbolt unlocking. Inside, the place was immaculate. The scent of clean linen and faint wood polish filled the air. The living room was small but thoughtfully decorated: a gray couch, a coffee table with a stack of books, a sleek flat screen mounted on the wall. The kitchenette had stainless steel appliances, spotless countertops, and a welcome note from Daniel sitting on the island. I picked up the card. "Welcome, make yourself at home. Let me know if you need anything." Simple, polite. No weird rules or excessive house instructions. I tossed my bag onto the couch and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first thing that felt off was the smoke detector. It was directly above the be-done of those sleek, modern units, flush with the ceiling. But there was a tiny black dot in the center of it, barely noticeable unless you were lying down and looking straight up. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for one thing. It was angled, not straight down like most detectors. It was tilted slightly downward toward the bed. I sat up slowly, my stomach tightening. It was probably nothing. Maybe it was just a design choice. Maybe I was overthinking it. Still, something gnawed at me. I stood on the bed, reaching up to inspect it. My fingers brushed over the small black dot. It wasn't smooth like the rest of the device. It felt like glass. A lens. My chest tightened. Number it couldn't be. I climbed down and grabbed my phone, quickly Googling how to tell if a smoke detector is a hidden camera. The results sent a sharp chill through me. Most modern hidden cameras use infrared sensors, meaning they'll reflect light in a certain way. If you shine a flashlight at them, the lens will often glow or bounce light back at you. My hands felt clammy as I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the black dot. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint glint. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the angle or the ceiling paint reflecting back at me. But something inside me wasn't convinced. I needed to be sure. I opened the camera on my phone and switched it to selfie mode. Then I held it up, angling it toward the smoke detector, looking at it through the screen. There it was, a tiny blinking red light. A camera. My stomach dropped. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some internet rumor. This was real. I was being recorded. I dropped the phone onto the bed, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. How long had it been running? How many guests had stayed here without knowing? I felt exposed, violated. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, snapped a photo of the detector, and stormed out of the bedroom. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing: I was getting out of there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I tried to steady my breathing. The deadbolt clicked, and I yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch. The cool night air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. I turned to my car and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline of a tall man, half shrouded in darkness. I took a shaky step back. "Daniel?" My voice came out uneven, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned slow, deliberate, and walked into the trees. I stood there, my breath ragged, my body rigid with fear. I didn't wait. I bolted for the car, threw my bag into the passenger seat, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were trembling so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I sped out of that driveway so fast the tires kicked up gravel, my heart still hammering. I drove straight into town and parked outside a well-lit gas station. Only then did I realize I was still shaking. I reached for my phone, ready to call Airbnb support, ready to report what I had found. But when I opened the app, something made my stomach drop. The listing was gone, not just unavailable, completely erased. And Daniel? His account had been deleted. I had no idea who he really was, or where that footage had ended up. I sat in my car, parked outside a gas station, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers ached. The Airbnb listing was gone, vanished like it had never existed. And Daniel? Deleted. I stared at the screen, my breathing uneven. How? Just an hour ago, his account had over 100 glowing reviews. Now, it was as if he'd never been there at all. I forced myself to take a slow breath, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Airbnb removed the listing after multiple reports. Maybe Daniel shut it down himself, covering his tracks the moment he realized I'd figured it out. Either way, I had no way to contact him. But I wasn't letting this go. I opened the Airbnb app's customer support chat and started typing. I just stayed at a listing that had hidden cameras. The host's account is gone, but I need to report this. I sent the message and waited, my leg bouncing with anxious energy. The gas station parking lot was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow on my windshield. A response popped up almost immediately. "Hello, thank you for reaching out. Can you provide the listing address and any photos or videos you took?" I quickly typed out the address and attached the picture of the smoke detector camera. Another message came. "We take privacy violations very seriously. Our trust and safety team will investigate immediately. Did you notice any other concerning details about the property or host?" I hesitated, then typed, "I saw someone outside right before I left. I think it was the host." The reply was slower this time. "Were you harmed or threatened in any way?" I exhaled, rubbing my temple. Number, not physically, but something wasn't right. I typed, no, but it felt like he was watching me. There was another pause then. We strongly recommend filing a police report in your local jurisdiction. Please let us know if you need further assistance. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was all they could do. Airbnb wouldn't hunt this guy down, they'd just remove him from their platform and move on. I needed to take this to the police. The station was about 10 minutes away, a squat brick building that looked more like an office than a law enforcement facility. I parked, gripping the wheel tightly for a moment before stepping out. Inside, the air was cool, sterile. A tired-looking officer sat behind a thick glass window. I cleared my throat. "Hi, I need to report something." The officer glanced up. "What's the issue?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling stupid. What was I even going to say? I found a camera in my Airbnb, then my host disappeared. It sounded crazy, but I couldn't just let it go. I took a breath. I stayed at an Airbnb tonight. I found a hidden camera in the bedroom. I left immediately, but when I tried to report it, the host's account had been deleted. The listing was erased, too. I don't know who he really is, and I'm worried about where the footage might end up. The officer's expression shifted. He sat up straighter. "A hidden camera?" I nodded quickly. "In the smoke detector facing the bed." He grabbed a notepad. "Did you take photos?" I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the picture and showing him. His eyes narrowed. "That's not good." I felt a surge of relief. At least he was taking it seriously. "Did you find any others?" he asked. I hesitated. I didn't get the chance to check everywhere. Once I found that one, I panicked and left. The officer nodded, scribbling something down. "You said the listing disappeared?" "Yeah. When I went back to check, it was completely gone. Same with the host's profile." The officer's brow furrowed. He tapped his pen against the desk, thinking, "Do you remember the address?" I nodded, quickly reciting it. He turned to his computer, typing. The glow from the monitor reflected off his glasses as he scanned the screen. Then his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly, his eyes flicking back and forth as he read something. My stomach clenched. "What?" He glanced at me. "How long ago did you book this place?" "A week ago. Why?" Another pause. Then he exhaled, sitting back in his chair. "That house doesn't belong to anyone named Daniel." A cold wave of unease crawled up my spine. "What do you mean?" He turned the monitor slightly, showing me the screen. The property was listed under a completely different name. Not Daniel. Someone else. Someone who hadn't owned it for over a year. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. Then who the hell did I just rent it from? The officer leaned forward. "That's what we need to find out." The next few hours were a blur of questions, reports, and waiting. Another officer took me to a small interview room, where I went through everything: how I booked the listing, what I found, the man I saw outside. Then they asked a question I hadn't considered. "Did you leave anything behind?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, a few things." In my rush to get out, I hadn't even thought about it. My toiletries, a charger, some clothes in the bathroom. The officer's expression darkened. "We need to send someone to check the house." A pit of dread formed in my stomach. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the station lobby when an officer walked in, a serious expression on his face. "We checked the house," he said. I sat up. "And?" He hesitated, then said something that made my entire body go cold. "It was empty." I blinked. "What?" "No furniture, no bedding, no dishes, just empty." My mouth went dry. That wasn't possible. I had slept there. I had walked through the kitchen, touched the couch, unpacked my bag. And now? Nothing. Like I had imagined the whole thing. The officer crossed his arms. Either this guy cleared out in a matter of hours, or he never lived there at all. A sinking realization hit me. It was staged. The officer nodded grimly. "That's what we think." I felt sick. I had stayed in a fake house, rented from a fake person, and the entire time I had been watched. My voice came out weak. "Did you find any cameras?" The officer sighed. "We found mounts for them, but they were all gone. Every trace of surveillance, every hidden device wiped clean. Whatever footage had been taken of me was already out there. I had no idea where, or who was watching." I sat in the police station, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my mind spinning. The house was empty, stripped bare, like it had never been furnished in the first place, like I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I had slept in that bed, touched those countertops, stood under that hidden camera, and felt my stomach turn when I realized what it was. And now it was all gone. The officer in front of me, a man in his late 40s with a weary expression, folded his hands on the desk. "I need you to be honest with me." I met his gaze, my pulse still hammering. "I am." He nodded slightly. "Tell me one more time, step by step." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, and went through it all again. The listing, the perfect reviews, the house that looked just like the photos, how I'd settled in, unpacked, and gone to bed thinking I was completely alone. Then the smoke detector, the black dot that wasn't supposed to be there, the reflection in my camera that gave it away, how I'd fled only to see him, the man standing at the edge of the driveway watching me. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "We're going to run a search on Daniel." I frowned. His account was deleted. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. "That doesn't mean he's gone." His partner, a younger officer with sharp eyes, spoke for the first time. "Airbnb hosts need verified identities to list properties. Even if he deleted his account, we might be able to trace it." A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. But then, the older officer's voice dropped slightly. "You said the house belonged to someone else, that the actual owner hadn't lived there in over a year." I nodded. He exchanged a look with his partner. Then he reached for a manila folder on the desk and slid it toward me. "We pulled the records. That house has been vacant for a while. No official tenants. No one named Daniel ever owned it." I stared at the folder, my throat tightening. "So, what does that mean?" The officer's voice was flat. "It means someone broke in, set up fake furniture, and ran an illegal Airbnb scam out of a house they didn't own." The words hit me like a punch. I shook my head. It looked real. It felt lived in. The younger officer leaned forward. "That's the point. Staging a property isn't hard if you know what you're doing. Cheap rental furniture, a few decorations. It doesn't take much to make a place look legitimate." I felt sick. I had stayed in a house that didn't belong to anyone. I had booked a room in a place that was never supposed to be rented. The officer continued. "We checked the walls, floors, outlets. There were mounts for at least 4 hidden cameras. 2 in the bedroom, 1 in the bathroom vent, 1 in the living room. But they were all removed before we got there." My stomach churned. I already knew what he was going to say next. "That footage is out there somewhere." I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were white. "Can you track him down?" The younger officer ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "We're trying. If he used a stolen identity, it'll be harder. But if we find anything, we'll let you know." It didn't feel like enough. It wasn't enough. But what else could I do? For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept my phone on me at all times, refreshing the Airbnb app, checking my email for any updates. Nothing. I searched online, hoping to find something about other guests who had stayed there. No one had reported it. No Reddit threads, no news articles, just silence. Then, on the 4th day, I got an email. "Airbnb support. Privacy violation case update." I opened it with shaking hands. The email was short, too short. They were conducting an internal investigation, but couldn't provide any details. They had removed the listing permanently. The host was banned from the platform. That was it. No legal action, no real consequences. I felt my stomach drop. He got away with it. A week later, I finally got a call from the police. It wasn't what I wanted to hear. They had nothing. The Airbnb account was linked to a fake identity, prepaid phone numbers, and an untraceable bank account. Whoever he was, he had planned this carefully. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trail. It was like he never existed. They promised to keep the case open, but I could hear it in their voices. This was over for them. Not for me. I tried to move on. I deleted the Airbnb app, blocked their emails. I stopped traveling altogether for a while. Even now, I triple-check every hotel room, every Airbnb my friends book. But the worst part, the part that still keeps me up at night, I never found out who he was, what he wanted, where he uploaded that footage, because someone, somewhere, has it. Maybe it's locked away on a hard drive. Maybe it's on the dark web, passed around by people I'll never meet. Maybe it's already been deleted. Or maybe, just maybe, it was never about the videos. Maybe he just wanted to watch me, in real time, and now that I left, maybe he's found someone else. I don't scare easily, never have. Growing up in a rough neighborhood and working in high-stress environments has made me thick-skinned and level-headed. I'm the kind of person who hears a strange noise at night and assumes it's the wind, or a raccoon, at worst. Monsters don't exist, and ghost stories are just that, stories. At least that's what I've always told myself. But I can't explain what happened to me that night. I had heard of skinwalkers before. The name alone is enough to send shivers down your spine. According to legend, they're shapeshifters, beings that can take on the form of animals or even humans. Some say they're witches cursed by dark rituals. Others say they're ancient spirits, feeding on fear. They mimic voices calling for help in tones that sound human but lack emotion, luring unsuspecting victims closer. I always brushed it off as folklore, just stories told to scare people from venturing too far into the wilderness. I never gave it much thought until I found myself in a situation that made me wonder if those stories were more than just tales. Life had been weighing on me. Work had become a relentless grind. Family tensions were at an all-time high, and even my friends seemed to drain me. I needed a break, somewhere to clear my head. That's how I found myself packing for a solo camping trip. No one to bother me, no deadlines, no expectations, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive to the campsite was long, winding through forested roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I decided on a secluded spot, miles away from any trailheads or public camping areas. I wanted solitude, and I got it. By the time I arrived at the trailhead and started hiking, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, the kind that bites just enough to remind you you're alive. As I made my way deeper into the woods, something caught my eye. A deer stood motionless a few yards off the trail, staring directly at me. Its body was perfectly still, too still, as though it were frozen in time. Its eyes were unnerving, not soft and curious like most deer, but sharp and focused. It felt like it was studying me. I kept walking, brushing it off as my imagination. But then there was another one. A second deer stood farther ahead, staring in the same unsettling way, and another. Each one seemed to appear out of nowhere, their heads turning slowly to watch me as I passed. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't move away either. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of trance, and for a moment I felt like I was too. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the spell broke. The deer shook their heads, snorted, and bounded off into the woods like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but unease crept in like a shadow I couldn't shake. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my gut. About halfway to my chosen campsite, I saw a man wandering through the trees. He was swaying slightly, his movements uneven, like he might be drunk. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his head was down, his face obscured. I thought about saying something, a quick, "Hey, you good?" But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and erratic, like he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. Or maybe it was the strange sensation that washed over me, a feeling like I shouldn't draw attention to myself. He didn't seem to notice me, and I passed him without incident. I told myself he was just a guy enjoying the woods in his own way. But deep down, I knew better. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had almost set. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and tried to relax. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But that stillness didn't bring peace. It felt oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. I was starting to feel a little better when I heard it. "Help! Help me!" It was a man's voice, distant but clear. The words carried through the trees, echoing faintly. At first, I thought someone might actually be in trouble. I stood, straining to listen. "Help me! Over here!" The voice came again, but this time, something about it felt wrong. The tone was too flat, too monotone, like someone mimicking a call for help rather than genuinely needing it. It lacked urgency. "Help me," the voice repeated, almost like a recording. The same inflection, the same rhythm, over and over. It was closer now, but I couldn't see anyone. My skin crawled. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but something in the back of my mind screamed, "Don't." I sat back down by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The voice kept calling, circling my campsite. It would fade into the distance, then grow louder again, moving in an erratic pattern. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding. I felt like I was being watched. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent my heart racing. I stayed in my tent, clutching a knife, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward my truck. As I passed the spot where I'd seen the man the day before, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were barefoot, long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They led off the trail and disappeared into the dense woods. I didn't stick around to investigate. I made it back to my truck, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away from that forest. To this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered out there. Was it just a drunken man lost in the woods, or something far darker? A skinwalker, perhaps, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I'll never be sure. I'm not easily frightened. In fact, if you were to ask anyone who knows me, they'd tell you I'm the last person to flinch at strange noises in the night. I've spent years camping alone in remote areas across the country. No one who's ever traveled as much as I have would bat an eye at a few rustling leaves or the distant call of an animal. But the night I spent in Rabbit Valley changed everything. It was a quiet evening. Too quiet, maybe. I'd been driving for hours, crossing the border between Colorado and Utah, and I needed to rest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place far enough from the highway to sleep without the hum of cars or the glare of streetlights. Rabbit Valley seemed like the perfect spot. It was desolate, surrounded by nothing but wide open space and rugged terrain. I'd heard about it from other campers as a peaceful, remote site, ideal for solitude. So, I parked my truck at one of the isolated campsites, which were at least 15 to 20 miles from the nearest road. There was only one other rig in the area, and they were far off in the distance. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. It was quiet. I set up my teepee-style tent, a new purchase off of Amazon. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me sheltered from the elements. The air was cold, crisp, and still, just the way I liked it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got settled in, ready to drift off. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the serene quiet. But it didn't last long. I woke to an odd sound, something faint but persistent. It started out as a scraping noise, almost like someone dragging their fingers across the nylon of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a light, deliberate sound, like someone was walking around my tent, running their fingers along the edges of the fabric. Slowly, methodically, back and forth, I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything outside my tent. There were no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart began to race. It was as if someone was walking in a slow circle around my tent, deliberately making sure I could hear every scrape of their fingers. The sound was eerily rhythmic, like they had all the time in the world. Minutes dragged on. Maybe it was only 5 minutes. Maybe it was 15. It felt like an eternity. I tried to steady my breath, to remain calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scraping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, my mind racing. Every inch of me screamed to act, to do something, but I didn't. I stayed there, silent, listening. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, some animal brushing up against the tent. But something inside me knew better. Another 15 minutes passed. The silence now felt suffocating. Then, without warning, it happened. My tent, the one I'd just pitched with such care, suddenly caved in. The center pole collapsed, and the entire structure folded inward, trapping me inside. I had a brief moment of disorientation, and I realized the only thing holding the tent at an angle was a small support beam that had somehow managed to stay intact. My heart was hammering in my chest as I ripped open the zipper of my tent. I didn't think, I just acted. I bolted out of the tent and ran for my truck. I crawled into the bed, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the grip, but I didn't feel safe enough to sleep. I stayed wide awake the entire night, waiting for daylight. The darkness outside seemed to close in on me, as if something were waiting for me to fall asleep. When the sun finally rose, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and went straight back to the campsite. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just my nerves? Was I imagining it? But deep down I knew I wasn't. Something was off, very off. I went to inspect the area, hoping to find some sign that would explain it away. Maybe it was a bear or a large animal that brushed up against the tent. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on, and that's when I saw them. Around my tent, in the cold desert dirt and snow, there were shoe prints. They weren't mine. I recognized my own tracks, leading to and from the campsite, but these were different. They were made by boots with pointed toes, deep imprints in the ground. The pattern they made was unmistakable. It was clear that someone had walked around my tent. Not just once, but multiple times. The prints were in a circle, as though someone had been pacing around me while I was inside. There were no other tracks, just these circular prints, making a steady loop around my tent, as if whoever it was had been studying me, waiting, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when it hit me. They had known I was inside. They knew I was alone. They had been waiting for me to make a move. And the sound I'd heard, the scraping, it wasn't a random animal, it was deliberate. Someone had been touching the fabric of my tent. Someone had been taunting me. I looked further into the valley, hoping for an explanation. But the tracks, those boots, had wandered off into the wilderness, leading further into the desolate land. There were no signs of any other campsites, no vehicles in sight. Just an empty, barren landscape stretching out before me. Whoever had been there wasn't coming back, but I didn't stick around to see if they would. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I threw my things into my truck, locked the doors, and drove off without a second thought. I didn't even care about the rest of the day's drive. All I cared about was getting out of there. I didn't look back. To this day, I haven't been back to Rabbit Valley, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, every time I go camping, every time I set up a tent and sit beneath the stars, I can't shake that feeling. The feeling of someone watching, someone waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. And every time the wind picks up and I hear a scrape on the side of my tent, I remember those boot prints. I remember the circle they made around me. I remember the eerie silence of that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the valley. I don't know if they were real or if it was all in my head. But I do know this. I'll never forget the sound of someone scraping their fingers across the side of my tent. I never put much thought into imaginary friends. When I was a kid, I had won myself a little boy named Timmy who lived under my bed and only came out at night. I barely remember him now, just vague childhood memories of talking to someone who was never really there. So, when my 5-year-old daughter Lily started talking about her new friend, I didn't think much of it. At first it was cute. She would chat away in her room, whispering excitedly like she was sharing secrets. Sometimes I'd hear her giggle at nothing, or turn suddenly as if someone had tapped her on the shoulder. When I asked her about it, she just smiled and said, "I'm playing with the tall man." That was the first time I felt it, a weird, uneasy sensation. I forced a chuckle. "Oh yeah, who's the tall man?" "He lives in my closet," she said simply, like it was the most normal thing in the world. A shiver crawled up my spine. Kids say weird things all the time, I reminded myself. It was just her imagination. Still, I found myself glancing toward her closet more often than usual, just in case. For the first few weeks, it was just talk, nothing serious. She would tell me how the tall man liked to sit in the corner and listen to her stories, how sometimes he played hide and seek. "How do you play hide and seek with him?" I asked one night as I tucked her in. Lily pulled the covers up to her chin and giggled. "He hides in the walls." I paused. "In the walls?" She nodded. "He's really good at it." My fingers stiffened around the edge of the blanket. I wanted to brush it off, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. That night I kept her closet door open. I don't know why. It wasn't like I was expecting to find anything. But as I lay in bed, staring at the faint sliver of her nightlight glowing under my own door, a nagging thought crept into my head. What if she wasn't making this up? The first time I felt real fear was about a week later. I had just put Lily to bed and was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard her start crying. Not just a little whimper, full-on sobbing. I ran into her room, heart pounding. She was sitting upright in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" I asked, already pulling her into my arms. Between hiccuping breaths, she whispered, "He's mad at me." I stiffened. "Who?" "The tall man." I swallowed hard. "Why is he mad?" She sniffled. "Because you closed the closet too early." A sharp chill ran through my body. I turned my head slowly toward the closet. It was open, but I knew for a fact I had closed it before tucking her in. I tried to stay calm. "Lily, did you open the closet?" She shook her head quickly, burying her face into my chest. I didn't want to look. I really didn't. But my eyes drifted toward the closet anyway. And that's when I saw it. The clothes inside were swaying. Not much, just the faintest movement, like someone had brushed past them, or had just been standing there. I felt my stomach drop. A suffocating wave of cold washed over me, my body screaming, "Move." I stood up quickly, flipping on the main light. I grabbed Lily and carried her into my room, locking the door behind us. That night she slept in my bed. I didn't sleep at all. The next day I did a full sweep of the house. I checked every window, every door, every lock. Nothing was open. Nothing was out of place. I even went into Lily's closet myself, pushing the hangers aside, knocking on the walls. Solid. No hidden spaces. Just my own paranoia making me crazy. That's what I told myself. But that night, Lily wouldn't sleep in her room. She clung to me, her little fingers gripping my shirt, whispering, "He doesn't like when you check the closet." I didn't know what to say to that. I just held her close and told her everything was okay, even though I wasn't sure if it was. The final straw came 2 nights later. It was just past midnight when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft scraping sound. I jolted awake, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned my head toward Lily. She was fast asleep beside me, her tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. The scraping sound came again. Slow, deliberate, coming from inside the wall. I held my breath, ears straining. For a long moment it was silent. Then, a whisper. Faint, just barely audible. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew exactly where it was coming from. Lily's closet. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the door, paralyzed. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp 3-knock pattern, coming from inside the closet. A cold, sinking terror rooted me in place. I waited. I listened. Nothing else came. The air in the room felt thick, too heavy to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached for my phone and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. I gritted my teeth and forced myself up, my entire body tense. I crept toward the closet, every instinct screaming don't. But I had to. I had to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I raised a shaky hand and, without giving myself a chance to hesitate, yanked the closet door open. Nothing. Just hangers, toys, the usual. I let out a breath. My head swam. Then, just as I was about to shut the door, I noticed something. A tiny sliver of darkness between the wall and the floor. I crouched down, pulse thudding in my ears. And that's when I saw it. A small gap. Not noticeable at first glance, but just big enough for someone to slip fingers through. Just big enough for someone to hide behind. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. And then, with shaking hands, I knocked back. 3 times. The same slow pattern. I held my breath. Waited. And then, 3 knocks came back. From inside the wall. I didn't move. My breath was locked in my chest, my hands frozen at my sides, my ears straining as if I had misheard. But I hadn't. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, coming from inside the wall. A cold, paralyzing dread settled in my bones. My rational mind was scrambling for an explanation, pipes, settling wood, anything that made sense. But deep down I knew. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't hearing things. Something or someone was knocking back. I stumbled backward, slamming the closet door shut so hard, the entire frame shuddered. My pulse was thundering in my ears, my skin damp with cold sweat. I didn't even realize I was shaking until I tried to grab my phone and nearly dropped it. I forced myself to take a deep breath, think. I needed to do something. Call the police and tell them that my closet was knocking back? They'd think I was insane. Wake Lily? Number absolutely not. I didn't want her anywhere near that room. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the nearest piece of furniture, a small dresser, and dragged it in front of the closet. The scraping sound of wood against wood made my skin crawl, but I didn't care. I wasn't opening that door again. I backed away slowly, staring at the closet like it might lunge at me. Nothing happened. I waited, listened. The silence stretched and stretched. Finally, after what felt like forever, I turned off the light and left the room. I didn't go back to sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it really was the house settling. Maybe the sound had been from outside, and I misheard it. I tried to be logical, tried to let it go. But then, at breakfast, Lily said something that made my stomach drop. "Mommy, why did you lock the tall man in the closet?" My fork clattered against my plate. I turned to her slowly, my throat tightening. "What did you say?" Lily frowned slightly, her little fingers poking at her cereal. He's mad at you. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I forced my voice to stay even. Lily, have you seen him today? She nodded. He peeked at me this morning, from the closet. I swallowed hard, but I moved the dresser in front of it. Lily tilted her head. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. He said he can still see you. My stomach turned. I forced out a shaky breath, trying to stay calm. Lily, honey, how long has the tall man been in your closet? She shrugged, taking another bite of cereal. A long time. I hesitated. And what does he look like? She thought about it for a moment. Then, very matter-of-factly, she said, he has no eyes. I nearly knocked over my chair. I was done. This was no longer just a child's imagination. Something was wrong. I needed answers. That afternoon I called my landlord. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I was hoping for something that would make sense of all this. She picked up on the third ring. This is Carol. Hi, this is... I cleared my throat. I live in the house on Maplewood. I had some questions about the property. A pause. All right. I hesitated. How the hell was I supposed to phrase this? Finally, I settled on, has anyone ever mentioned strange noises in the walls? Silence. It stretched on too long. My grip on the phone tightened. Carol? She let out a slow breath. Why do you ask? Something in her tone made my stomach knot. I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. Just weird sounds at night. You know how old houses are. Another pause. Then quietly she said, you should check the attic. A heavy weight dropped in my chest. What? Another breath. You have an attic access, right? In the hallway? I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto the small square panel in the ceiling just outside Lily's room. I had never thought much about it. It was one of those pull-down panels with a flimsy wooden ladder inside. My skin crawled. Carol's voice was tense. Just check it. I swallowed hard. Why? A beat of silence. Then, carefully, she said, because the last tenants complained about the same thing. I went cold. My fingers clenched around the phone. What do you mean? Carol sighed. They swore they heard footsteps in the ceiling at night, whispering. They even thought someone was living up there. My mouth went dry. And, she continued, when we finally checked, we found nothing. But the dust was disturbed, like someone had been up there moving around. A thick, suffocating silence stretched between us. My entire body felt numb. Finally, Carol added, almost reluctantly, you're not the first person to call me about this. I stood under the attic hatch for a long time, staring at it. The air in the hallway felt thick, still, like something was waiting. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I had to. With shaking hands, I grabbed a chair and positioned it directly under the panel. I climbed on top, my pulse thudding painfully in my ears. The pull string was covered in dust. I grabbed it with trembling fingers and yanked. The wooden ladder creaked as it unfolded. A wave of cold air rushed down from the attic. It smelled stale. I grabbed my phone, flipped on the flashlight, and slowly, cautiously, climbed the first few steps. The attic was dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed light whole. I lifted my phone, shining the beam around. The space was empty. Just wooden beams, insulation, footprints in the dust, a trail of them leading to the far corner. My breath hitched. I lifted the phone higher, and then in the corner I saw it. A hole, a gap in the attic floor, just big enough for someone to slip through. To the walls, to the closet. The realization hit me like ice water. Someone had been in Lily's closet. Not a ghost. Not an imaginary friend. Someone real. Hiding. Watching. My stomach twisted. Then, from behind me, a sound, a soft exhale. Too close. Right behind me, I felt the breath before I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible exhaler right behind me. Every muscle in my body locked. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. My grip on my phone tightened. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But something in my brain whispered, "You have to." Slowly, I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just the dark, yawning space of the attic behind me. The silence was worse than the noise. I swallowed hard, forcing my heartbeat to slow. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the air shifted when I pulled the attic door open. Maybe a sudden creak to my left. I whipped my phone's flashlight toward the sound. The dim glow flickered over wooden beams, insulation, a blanket, stuffed into the farthest corner of the attic. Not folded, not placed neatly, crumpled, used. Next to it, an empty water bottle, a torn granola bar wrapper. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just a hiding place. Someone had been living here. For how long? A week? A month? Since before I moved in? I took a step back, my foot pressing into the creaky wooden plank beneath me. My breath was coming too fast, my hands trembling as I lifted my phone, scanning the attic again. The footprints in the dust, the hole leading into the walls. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't Lily's imagination. There was someone in my house. I turned, moving fast. I nearly tripped over my own feet as I scrambled down the attic ladder, landing hard on the hallway floor. My ankle twisted slightly, sending a sharp stab of pain up my leg, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the chair and shoved it against the attic door, my hands shaking as I stepped back, staring at it. The house was too quiet. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Lily. I turned and ran toward her room. She was still asleep, curled up in my bed, her tiny hands clutching her stuffed rabbit. I exhaled sharply, relief crashing over me. I sat beside her, brushing the hair from her face, my fingers still trembling. What the hell was I supposed to do? The police. I had to call the police. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over the dial pad. Then I froze. A new sound. Soft. Slow. Coming from the closet. A gentle knock. Not loud. Not frantic. Like whoever was inside didn't want to wake Lily. My throat tightened. I turned my head slowly, my breath shallow. The closet door was open an inch. I stared at it, my body rigid with fear. I knew I had closed it. And behind that door, the gap in the wall, the one that led to the attic. I stood, moving carefully so I wouldn't wake Lily. My mind was screaming at me to run, to grab my daughter and get the hell out. But I had to see. I had to know. I crept toward the closet, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every step felt too loud. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The closet was dark, but I could just barely make out the gap in the drywall. It was wider now. Not a sliver anymore. Not a small, unnoticed crack. It looked peeled back, like someone had been using it, like someone had crawled through it. I reached for the light chain and pulled. The bulb flickered on. My stomach dropped. There were fingerprints on the inside of the drywall, smudges in the dust, trailing up and down, like someone had been gripping the edges, like someone had been climbing in and out. My hands started shaking uncontrollably. I took a step back, and then I heard it, a whisper, so soft, so close, right in my ear. "I see you," I screamed. I don't remember moving. I don't remember grabbing Lily. All I know is that I ran. I tore out of the house, my daughter clutched in my arms, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't stop until I was outside, my bare feet hitting the freezing pavement of the driveway. I barely registered the sound of my own voice as I called 911. All I could think about was that voice, that whisper. So close. Too close. The police arrived fast. Faster than I expected. Maybe it was the hysterical way I had screamed into the phone, my words barely coherent. Maybe it was because I was crying in the driveway when they pulled up, my daughter clinging to me, half asleep and confused. 2 officers searched the house while another tried to calm me down. I couldn't stop shaking. I could barely get the words out. "There's someone in there." The officer nodded, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "We'll handle it. Just stay here with your daughter." I clutched Lily tightly as she buried her face into my shoulder. Minutes passed. Then shouting. Loud, urgent, a crash. My heart lurched. The officers had found something. One of them came back out, his face tense. He pulled the other officer aside, speaking in hushed tones. I stepped forward, barely able to breathe. "What?" I demanded. "Did you find him?" The officer turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We found signs that someone's been living in the attic." My body went cold. But he's not there now. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Where? Where is he? The officer hesitated. Then carefully he said, "We don't know." They searched for hours. The attic, the walls, the crawl space beneath the house. But he was gone. Whoever he was, he had escaped. The police found a sleeping bag, stolen food, a small notebook filled with numbers and scribbled notes. They wouldn't tell me what was in it, but I saw their faces when they read it. I knew it wasn't good. I packed up that night. Lily and I left and never looked back. The house is empty now. Someone new will move in eventually. And maybe, just maybe, he'll come back. Because one thing still keeps me up at night. One thing the officer told me before I left. They dusted for prints. They found several sets. But one of them was Lily's. I never considered myself a paranoid person. I was rational, logical, the kind of person who double-checked the locks at night but never dwelled on what might be lurking in the dark. That all changed when I moved into the apartment on Sycamore Street. I had found the listing online. A 1-bedroom, 3rd-floor unit in an old, pre-war building that had just the right amount of charm and history. It wasn't cheap, but it was in my budget, and after years of roommates and shared spaces, I was eager for solitude. The landlord, an older man with tired eyes and a cigarette-stained voice, handed me the keys without much conversation. "Quiet building," he muttered. "Good neighbors. Just keep to yourself." I should have known then. The first few nights were uneventful. The apartment was small but cozy, with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors that groaned under my steps. I spent my evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the rhythm of the place. Occasionally I'd hear muffled sounds from the units beside me, footsteps above, a door closing in the hallway, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then I started noticing things. At first they were small details, easy to dismiss. A kitchen cabinet I could have sworn I closed being slightly ajar in the morning, my keys not quite where I left them, the lingering scent of cigarette smoke despite no one in the building appearing to smoke. It unsettled me, but I convinced myself I was imagining things. After all, it was an old building. Things shifted. I was just adjusting. Then came the knocks. They started around midnight. Faint, rhythmic, always 3 soft taps against my front door. The first time, I hesitated before checking the peephole. The hallway was empty. No shadows under the door, no lingering presence. I chalked it up to pipes, the wind, anything but someone actually knocking. But it happened again, and again, and again. I started keeping my phone by my bed, half expecting to need it, but the knocking never escalated. Just those same, steady 3 taps, like a question waiting for an answer. Then, one night, I woke up to something worse. It wasn't the knocking this time. It was a sound The distinct, deliberate click of my front door unlocking. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. I was certain I had locked it. I always did. My throat tightened as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. The door didn't open. No footsteps followed, but I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, sleep deprivation. I double-checked the lock before leaving for work, pulling the door hard to make sure it was secure. That night I placed something small, a stray penny, on the doorknob. It was a stupid test, but I needed proof. When I woke up, the penny was on the floor. I stared at the penny for a long time, my mind scrambling for explanations. Had I brushed against the door in my sleep? Had some shift in the air knocked it off? No, that wasn't possible. Someone had touched the knob. Someone had been inside. I checked every inch of the apartment. The windows were locked, the closet was empty, no signs of a break-in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night I pushed a chair against the door. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I had some control. I went to bed with my phone clutched in my hand, my heart racing at every creak and groan of the old building. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the knocking started. 3 soft taps. I held my breath. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle violently, didn't shake like someone was trying to force their way in. It just turned, slow and deliberate, testing. I could hear the soft scrape of metal, the quiet pressure of someone pushing, just slightly, against the door. The chair held. I sat up in bed, my stomach twisting. I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That someone might be trying to get in? That I thought someone had been inside before? There was no real evidence, no forced entry, no threats, just a locked door and an unlocked one. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The knob stilled. The hallway beyond my door was silent. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, my fear had turned into something else. Determination. I needed proof. I needed to know that I wasn't losing my mind. So I bought a cheap security camera. I set it up in my living room, angled toward the door. If someone was messing with me, I'd have evidence. That night, I locked up as usual, placed another penny on the doorknob, and went to bed with my phone screen glowing beside me. I barely slept. By morning, the penny was on the floor again. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, pulling up the footage. The screen was grainy, the dim glow of the hallway light giving the apartment an eerie, washed-out look. I scrubbed through the timeline, scanning for movement. At 12:03 a.m., the feed glitched. Just for a second, just long enough to make my stomach drop. Then the frame settled. The door, the knob turning, and just before the feed cut out completely, I saw it. A hand, pale, thin, pressing against the peephole from the outside. I dropped my phone. My breath hitched in my throat as my mind tried to process what I had just seen. A hand, someone's hand, covering the peephole. They had been standing there, listening, waiting. And somehow, they had known about the camera. I forced myself to pick up my phone again, my hands trembling as I replayed the footage. The feed had cut out completely after that moment, leaving nothing but a frozen frame of the door, the knob still slightly turned. I tried to convince myself that it could have been a malfunction, a glitch in the camera, but deep down, I knew the truth. Someone didn't want to be seen. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, checking the locks obsessively, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. I barely ate. Every noise from the hallway made my skin crawl. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone knocked on my door and touched my peephole? They'd brush it off. I needed something undeniable. That night I made a plan. I pushed the chair against the door again, but this time I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room with the lights off, phone in hand, recording. If they came back, I'd hear them. I'd see them. The wait felt endless. Hours dragged by in suffocating silence. My eyelids grew heavy, but I refused to let myself sleep. Then, at 12:03 a.m., the knocking came. 3 soft taps. I gripped my phone tighter, barely breathing. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly, carefully, like someone testing to see if I'd forgotten to lock it. The chair creaked under the pressure, holding firm. But this time, there was something else. A sound. A low, muffled breathing. Not heavy, not aggressive, just calm, steady breaths, as if whoever was outside was patient. Waiting. I felt cold all over. My fingers hovered over my phone screen, about to dial 911, when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A whisper. Right outside the door. "I see you." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My body had gone rigid with pure terror. It wasn't loud, wasn't a threat, just a statement, quiet and sure, like they already knew how this would end. And then silence. No footsteps, no retreating sounds, just the overwhelming, paralyzing quiet of an empty hallway. I stayed like that until the first light of morning crept through my window, my body frozen in place, my mind racing. Whoever they weren't trying to break in. They were waiting for me to open the door. Morning didn't bring relief. If anything, the daylight only made things worse. There was no denying what had happened anymore. Someone had been outside my door, whispering, waiting. Someone knew I was there. I needed out. I packed a bag with essentials. Wallet, keys, phone, anything I could grab with shaking hands. I wasn't sure where I was going. Maybe a hotel, maybe a friend's place. I just knew I couldn't stay here another night. But before I left, I had to check something. I hesitated at the door, heart pounding, then crouched down and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, just the dim yellow glow of the overhead lights. But the air felt wrong, like something had just been there, standing close enough for me to feel its presence through the door. I reached for the knob, then stopped. Something was taped to it. A single piece of paper, folded neatly. My throat tightened as I pulled it off, my fingers trembling. The note was short, written in messy, slanted handwriting. "You locked the door. Good." I dropped it like it burned. My legs felt weak, my stomach twisted. The meaning was clear. They had tried to get in, and they had wanted me to know. I should have left then. I should have grabbed my bag and never looked back. But fear does strange things to the mind. Instead of running, I did something stupid. I checked the security camera. The footage loaded slowly, the grainy image of my front door appearing on the screen. I skipped through the timeline, stopping at 12:03 a.m. My breath caught. At first, there was nothing. Then, movement. A shadow just at the edge of the frame. A figure, stepping forward. They were tall, unnervingly thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed to blend into the walls. But the worst part, the part that made my skin crawl, was their face, or rather, the lack of one. The person had something pulled over their head. A mask, maybe? A hood? There were no features, no eyes, just a smooth, blank surface, staring directly at the camera. Then, they raised a hand. Slowly, deliberately, they reached forward and covered the lens. The footage cut out. I shut off my phone and backed away from the door, my entire body screaming at me to go. Now. I didn't stop to grab anything else. I yanked open the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the hallway was empty. My legs felt unsteady as I forced myself to walk, not run, just walk, toward the stairwell. I was almost at the exit when I heard it. A door opening. Not mine. One further down the hall. I didn't look. I didn't turn around. I just ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold morning light. The streets were empty, the city still waking up, but my mind was racing. I needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere with people. I ducked into a cafe a few blocks away, hands still shaking as I ordered a coffee just to have an excuse to sit. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't want to look, but I did. A new notification from my security app. I hesitated before opening it, dread curling in my stomach. The camera had recorded one last clip before I left. I pressed play. The footage was short, only a few seconds, the hallway still and silent. Then the door at the end of the hall creaking open. A figure stepped out. Not a stranger, not someone masked or hooded. It was my neighbor. The quiet man who lived a few doors down, the one I had only seen in passing, the one who never spoke. He was still wearing the same dark clothes from the footage, but now, in the clarity of daylight, I could see his face. Expressionless, calm, like he hadn't just spent nights knocking, whispering, trying to get in. Then, just before the video ended, he turned to look directly at the camera. And he smiled. I left the city that day. I called my landlord, told him I was breaking my lease, and never set foot in that apartment again. I never went to the police. What would I even say? That my neighbor was standing in the hallway at night? That he smiled at a camera? There was no crime, no real evidence of anything, just a feeling. A deep, bone-chilling certainty that if I had opened my door that night, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I don't know what he wanted. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up thinking I hear 3 soft knocks against my door. And I will never, never check to see who it is. I never thought I'd be the type to get spooked easily. I've always considered myself pragmatic, grounded in reality, unwilling to entertain paranoia. But if there's one thing I've learned in the past week, it's that some fears aren't irrational. I moved into this house 6 months ago. It was my first real step toward independence after leaving a long-term relationship. The breakup hadn't been messy, just overdue. We both knew it, but I'd clung to the familiar for longer than I should have. When I finally signed the lease for this place, a modest single-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I felt something close to relief. A fresh start, a space that was entirely mine. The house itself was nothing spectacular, but it was enough. 2 bedrooms, a small backyard, a driveway just wide enough for my car. The neighborhood was eerily still at night, which I found peaceful at first. After years of city life, the absence of sirens and distant chatter felt almost unnatural, but I adjusted. Because I lived alone, I took security seriously. I had a Ring doorbell camera installed the week I moved in, along with deadbolts and motion-activated lights. It wasn't paranoia, just common sense. I liked the idea of knowing who was outside before answering the door, and the notifications reassured me. For the first few months, the footage was uneventful, just passing cars, stray cats, and the occasional neighbor retrieving their mail. Then, last Wednesday, I got the first notification. It was 3:13 a.m. I woke to the soft chime of my phone alerting me to motion detected at the front door. Half asleep, I reached for my phone, expecting to see the usual: a car driving by, a possum rustling through the bushes. Instead, I saw him, a man standing perfectly still at the edge of my porch. His posture was unsettling, unnaturally rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He wasn't facing the door, not directly. His head was tilted downward, chin just slightly tucked in, as if he were looking at the camera through his brow. I stared at the image, my pulse beginning to thud dully in my ears. There was something profoundly unsettling about his stillness. He wasn't shifting his weight, wasn't adjusting his stance. He just stood there. I watched for several minutes, expecting him to move, to ring the doorbell, to knock, but he never did. After what felt like forever, I turned on the microphone feature and spoke, my voice groggy but firm. "Can I help you?" The man didn't react. I watched the screen, waiting for even the smallest movement, a flinch, a turn of the head, but he remained utterly motionless. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Sir, are you okay?" Nothing. Then, As if someone had pressed fast forward on a tape, he turned and walked away. The suddenness of his movement jarred me. He didn't pause, didn't hesitate, just turned on his heel and strode off into the night, disappearing past the edge of my camera's frame. I sat there, staring at the now empty porch, my mind racing. What the hell was that? A lost drunk? Someone with a mental illness? A harmless, albeit creepy stranger? That's what I told myself, as I forced my racing heart to slow. By morning, it almost felt like a dream. The next night, I got the notification again. 3:12 a.m. I sat up so fast my vision swam. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I pulled up the live feed, already knowing what I would see. He was back, but this time he was closer, standing one step closer to my front door than the night before. My stomach twisted as I took in his posture, exactly the same. Arms loose at his sides, shoulders unnaturally slack, his head tilted just enough to give the impression that he was watching me through the camera. I felt an unfamiliar sting of fear in my chest. This wasn't just a lost traveler or a confused stranger. This was intentional. I turned on the microphone again, my voice sharper now. "Who are you?" He didn't move, didn't react. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay even. "You need to leave." Still, nothing. Then, after another long, unbearable moment, walked away. Same as before. The moment I spoke, he turned and left. I barely slept that night. By morning, my rational brain was at war with my instincts. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he was a sleepwalker. Maybe nothing. Something wasn't right. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? That a man stood silently outside my door 2 nights in a row. That wasn't a crime. Not yet. So instead, I did what any anxious person would do. I stayed up the next night, waiting. I kept my phone next to me, screen brightness dimmed, the Ring app open. I forced myself to keep the lights off, hoping to avoid drawing attention. As 3 a.m. neared, my heartbeat felt like a drum against my ribs. Then the notification. My breath caught in my throat. "Motion detected at your front door." Hands trembling, I tapped the notification, my pulse roaring in my ears. The feed loaded. My stomach turned to ice. He was even closer. This time, he stood directly in front of my door, a single foot away. My skin went cold. His face, I could see his face, this time. But something was wrong. His mouth was slightly open, his lips parted just enough that I could see the gleam of teeth. I had the strangest, most irrational thought as he smiling. I didn't speak this time. I just watched, waiting, holding my breath. Then his head tilted. It was so subtle, so slow, that at first I thought I imagined it. But no, he was moving, just slightly, leaning toward the camera, like he was trying to hear something. I couldn't take it anymore. I flipped on my porch light. The instant the light flooded the area, he bolted. No hesitation, no slow, eerie retreat like before. He turned and ran. Fast. I barely caught the blur of his movement before he vanished into the night. My fingers were already dialing 911. I didn't care if it wasn't technically a crime. I wasn't waiting for it to become one. The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 officers, both looking more irritated than concerned, as if they had expected a drunken disturbance or a false alarm. I didn't care, I just wanted someone to listen. I met them outside, arms crossed over my chest, trying to suppress the nervous tremor in my hands. I replayed everything, from the first night's footage to the way he ran the moment the porch light turned on. One of the officers, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, jotted notes in a small pad. The other, younger and lankier, sighed audibly. "So, he didn't try to break in?" "No," I admitted, but my voice hardened. "That doesn't mean this is normal." The older officer gave a small nod. "You have the footage?" I pulled up the videos on my phone, my fingers shaking slightly as I played them. The younger cop leaned in first, frowning at the eerie stillness of the man on screen. The first night, then the second when he was closer. Finally, I showed them the most recent clip where he stood directly in front of my door. When the man on screen tilted his head ever so slightly, the older cop exhaled, shifting on his feet. "Okay," he muttered. The younger one, still skeptical, crossed his arms. He could just be casing the place. I shook my head. Then why didn't he try to get in? Why hasn't he knocked, spoken, done anything except stand there? Neither of them had an answer. The older cop sighed. "We'll file a report, but there's not much we can do unless he actually commits a crime." I clenched my jaw, already knowing that was going to be their response. "What if he comes back?" "Call us," the younger one said, "and maybe leave the porch light on." It seemed to scare him off. I wanted to scream. That's it? That's all they had? But arguing wouldn't change anything. They did a quick sweep of my yard, shining their flashlights along the fence line, but they didn't find anything, no footprints, no signs that someone had been lurking for hours. Just like that, they left. I watched their taillights disappear down the street, then turned back to my house. My front door suddenly looked different. Thinner, weaker, like it wouldn't do a damn thing to stop him if he really wanted in. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in my living room, curled up on the couch, my laptop open with a fresh Google search staring back at me. How to get rid of a stalker. The results were frustratingly vague. Get security cameras, I already had one. Install better locks done. Call the police, I had, and it got me nowhere. The best advice? Leave. I hated that answer. This was my home. I wasn't going to let some unhinged stranger drive me out of it. But when I checked my phone around 3 a.m., the breath left my lungs. Motion detected at your front door. I nearly dropped my phone. My fingers moved on their own, opening the Ring app, my vision narrowing to the small screen. The feed loaded. My blood turned to ice. He was back, but he wasn't standing at the door anymore. He was crouched. His body was lowered to the ground, his face inches from the camera. My breath caught in my throat. His mouth was open slightly wider than before. His eyes, too wide, stared directly into the lens. I felt like he could see me, like he knew I was watching. The camera had audio recording on by default, but I had never heard anything on the previous clips. Tonight was different. I turned up the volume and nearly dropped my phone. He was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first, just a low, murmuring hum, like he was talking to himself. Then suddenly his voice became clear. The notification sat on my screen like a warning I wasn't ready to face. Motion detected in your backyard. I stared at the words, my mind momentarily blank, my body frozen in place. The house felt too quiet. The air around me had a thickness to it, like the silence itself was waiting for me to react. My hand trembled as I tapped the notification. The video feed loaded. My stomach lurched. There he was, standing at the far end of my backyard, just barely visible in the grainy glow of the porch light. He wasn't at the door this time. He had gone around. For the first time, I could see his entire body. He was thin, too thin. His clothes looked baggy, almost oversized, like they didn't belong to him. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his fingers slightly curled. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if his neck couldn't quite hold the weight. And then, slow deliberately, he stepped forward. Not fast. Not running. Just walking. Straight toward my house. A sharp pang of panic hit me square in the chest, snapping me out of my trance. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse thudding in my ears as I rushed to the window overlooking the yard, my breath caught in my throat. The back porch light was still on. The camera feed hadn't glitched. He was real. He was there. And he was closer than before. My body acted before my brain did. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. It rang once, twice. Then, bang, the sound rattled through the house. I let out a choked gasp, my hands tightening around the phone. The operator's voice came through. 911, what's your emergency? There's... My voice came out, ragged, breathless. I turned back to the window. He was gone. I blinked rapidly, my vision scanning the yard. The spot where he'd been standing was empty. No sign of movement, no retreating figure, nothing. The operator's voice came again. Hello? I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. Someone's in my backyard. The words felt foreign, like I wasn't the one saying them, like I was still trying to convince myself this was actually happening. Are they attempting to enter your home? I didn't know. My hands shook violently as I flipped through my camera feeds. Front door? Clear. Side yard? Empty. Backyard? No one there. But that didn't make sense. Where the hell did he go? The only way out of the backyard was through the gate or over the fence, and I hadn't heard either move. Officers are en route, the operator said, her tone calm but firm. Stay inside. Do not engage with them. I barely muttered a response before hanging up. Then, cautiously, I made my way toward the back door. Every instinct in my body was screaming, don't. But I had to see. I kept the porch light on, my fingers hovering over the deadbolt. My other hand gripped the baseball bat I had grabbed from my closetta, useless weapon, but still, something. My breath felt too loud in the silence. I pressed my eye to the peephole. Darkness. Nothing but the faint glow of the porch light bouncing off the wooden fence. Where the hell did he go? Then, a tap. I nearly dropped the bat. A soft, rhythmic tap coming from the side of the house. I turned, my stomach twisting. My side window. Slowly, hesitantly, I crept toward it, my pulse hammering in my ears. The window had blinds, partially drawn, leaving just an inch of open space at the bottom. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I leaned forward, just enough to see through the small gap. And there he was. His face, right up against the glass. My breath hitched. My entire body seized with cold, gut-wrenching terror. He was grinning. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across his too-thin face. His lips were parted slightly, just enough to show his teeth. And his eyes, they weren't right. Not crazed, not angry, just focused, intentional. Like he was enjoying this. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. I stumbled back so fast I nearly tripped. My shoulders slammed against the wall, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Then sirens. The sudden wail of police sirens tore through the quiet night. Red and blue lights flashed through my windows. And just like that, he was gone. The cops didn't find him. Again. They searched the entire property, the surrounding yards, even a few blocks down the street. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Like he had vanished. I stood outside, wrapped in a blanket, my entire body still shaking violently. One of the officers, the same sharp-eyed woman from before, approached me. "Are you absolutely sure it was the same man?" I shot her a look. I saw his face. Her expression stayed neutral, but something behind her eyes shifted. "You need to stay somewhere else for a few nights," she said. I shook my head. "I have nowhere else to go." She hesitated, then sighed. "We'll do extra patrols in the area. But listen, whoever this guy is, he's not just watching anymore. He's pushing boundaries." A cold pit formed in my stomach. Next time, he might not run. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my living room, bat in hand, staring at the locked doors, waiting for another notification. None came. Morning finally arrived, and with it, a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. I spent the day researching emergency security upgrades. I scheduled an installation for the next morning. Reinforced locks, motion sensors inside, a second camera facing the backyard. I wasn't taking chances anymore. By nightfall, I felt exhausted but prepared. Then, just before midnight, someone knocked on my door. I froze. Not the ring notification, not motion detected. A knock. Soft, slow, deliberate. I grabbed my phone, pulling up the camera feed. My stomach dropped. There was no one there. The porch was empty, but the knocking continued. 3 steady taps. And then, from behind me, tap, tap, tap. From the backyard, the knocking didn't stop. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, the weight of silence pressing down on me. 3 knocks, from the front door. 3 more, from the backyard. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The ring feed still showed nothing. No movement, no figures, no one was there. But I heard it. I felt it. The cold, inescapable reality that I was not alone. A slow, sickening realization crept in. He wasn't just testing my fear anymore. He was playing with it. I forced my body to move. My limbs felt sluggish, weighed down by the pulse of panic flooding my veins. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind screaming, "Do something." I tightened my grip on the bat in my other hand, my breath unsteady as I turned toward the back window. The knocking had stopped. I peered through the blinds, keeping my movements slow, careful. The backyard light was still on. The camera feed had no motion detected. But I could feel him. My stomach twisted painfully. I tapped 911 again, my voice hushed but urgent. He's back. He's knocking on both sides. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Officers are on their way. Stay inside. Keep all doors and windows locked. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Then a sound cut through the silence. The doorknob rattled. My breath hitched. I turned, my body rigid, my eyes locked on the front door. The handle twisted, slowly, carefully, as if testing for weakness. I couldn't breathe. This was different. This wasn't just standing and watching. This was him trying to come inside. My entire body screamed to run. But to where? There was nowhere to go. I raised the bat, my hands trembling. I backed away, inch by inch, toward the kitchen. If he got in, I needed something better than a bat. A knife, something sharp, something that could stop him. The doorknob stopped rattling. Silence. I held my breath. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low, almost too faint to make out. "I see you." My stomach dropped. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the house. My body locked up. Number. No, no, no. That wasn't possible. I spun, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space behind me. The hallway stretched into shadows, leading to the bedroom and the second, smaller guest room. The air felt heavy, thick, like I was being watched. I gripped the bat so tightly my hands ached. A faint creak echoed down the hall. From the guest room, my throat went dry. I had locked everything. Hadn't I? I forced my legs to move, my steps cautious, deliberate. Every inch of my skin prickled with the overwhelming sensation that something was wrong. I reached the guest room door. It was open, just an inch. The way it always was when I walked past it at night. I had never thought much of it before. Now it felt like a trap. I braced myself, raised the bat. Then, with a sharp breath, I kicked the door wide open. The room was dark. Still, empty. My pulse thundered. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to look around. The closet was closed, the window locked. I took a step forward, then another. My breath was uneven, my nerves frayed. I reached for the closet handle. one last place to check. Then something moved. A low, rustling sound. Not in the closet. Not behind me. Above me. In the vent. My chest constricted. The vent cover was loose, just barely, like it had been shifted recently. I stared, horrified, as the realization hit me like a tidal wave. He had been inside the house all along. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran. I barely made it 3 steps before something crashed behind me, a sudden violent sound metal hitting the floor. He was coming down. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the front door, my lungs burning, my fingers fumbling with the locks. Then sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The police. A sharp, heavy thud sounded from behind me. I felt the air shift as someone moved fast. The officers burst through the door. I turned, my vision blurring, my chest heaving. He was gone. The vent cover lay on the ground. The small, narrow opening gaped like a tunnel leading into darkness. But he was nowhere in sight. The officers moved fast, weapons drawn, clearing the house room by room. Then, from the hallway, one of them shouted, "The attic hatch is open." My stomach clenched. They found him. The next moments were a blur yelling, stomping boots, the sharp crack of wood splitting as they pulled someone down. And then a face. His face. Thin, hollow, his skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones. His clothes were stained, torn in places. He looked like he hadn't been outside in weeks. And his eyes, they were locked on me. Even as the officers pinned him down, even as they hauled him away in cuffs, she never stopped staring. His mouth twitched. Then, just before they dragged him out the door, he whispered soft, knowing, like a secret just for me. I was inside for a long time. They found a makeshift space in the attic. A small, disgusting nest of blankets, empty water bottles, food wrappers. He had been living above me, watching, listening, slipping in and out without me ever knowing. The worst part? They found a notebook, filled with pages of observations. About me. My schedule. What time I went to bed. What nights I left the house. And in one entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Soon. I moved out immediately. Sold the house. Left everything behind. Even now, months later, I still can't sleep without checking the vents, without checking the locks, the doors, the ceilings. Because the truth is, I don't think he ever wanted to break in. I think he was waiting for me to find him. And I had. Just in time." I don't know where to start with this, but I can say for certain that I'll never live alone again. This happened about 6 months ago, and I still can't sleep without checking the vents in every room. I still can't walk into my apartment without scanning the ceiling, looking for any signs that something or someone has been there. Even now, just typing this out makes my hands shake. For context, I had just moved into my new apartment a few months before everything started. I had gotten out of a long-term relationship, and for the first time in years, I wanted a space that was entirely my own. It was a small, one-bedroom unit in a decently nice neighborhood just outside of Seattle. Not a luxury apartment by any means, but cozy. The kind of place where you could hear your neighbors through the walls if they were being too loud, but otherwise, it was quiet. That's what I liked about it. Just enough life around me to feel safe, but still peaceful enough to feel like home. I lived on the 2nd floor, and because the building was older, the vents were huge. Not the tiny little slits you see in newer apartments, but the large metal grates, big enough that I could have easily stuck my whole arm inside. They weren't just in the ceiling either. There was one directly on the wall in my bedroom, another in the hallway, and one in the living room near the floor. I didn't think much of it at the time, other than how obnoxiously big they were. I should have thought more about them. It started with little things. I remember the first night I noticed it, because I was lying in bed, exhausted, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound. It wasn't loud, just barely audible over the hum of my ceiling fan. It wasn't even consistent. Just a few small noises here and there coming from the vent on my bedroom wall. I remember thinking it was probably just the building settling or maybe the wind hitting it at a weird angle. But then I heard it again, a faint shuffling. It was so soft that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I got up, turned on my bedside lamp, and stared at the vent for a while. It was pitch black behind the metal grate. No movement, no sound. After a few minutes, I shook it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I forgot about it. For the next few weeks, the noises became something I just got used to. I convinced myself it was mice, maybe even a rat. I knew the idea should have grossed me out, but I figured, what else could it be? The building was old. Maybe the vents were connected to the basement, and some rodents had made their way in. I even called my landlord about it, but she brushed me off, saying they had regular pest control inspections, and I was probably just hearing the pipes. Fine, whatever. It wasn't a big deal. At least not at first. Then, things started moving. It was subtle. Small things at first. A cup that I knew I had left on the counter would be in the sink. My keys wouldn't be where I swore I had put them. My blankets looked slightly rumpled when I got home, like someone had been sitting on my bed. Again, I told myself it was just me being absent-minded. Maybe I was adjusting to living alone for the first time. I'd always lived with someone before, so maybe I was just noticing things more. Then one night I woke up to my closet door open. I went back the next morning convinced I'd overreacted. Maybe it really was just a trick of the light. Maybe I'd let my nerves get the best of me. That's what I told myself as I unlocked my door, heart pounding in my chest. The apartment looked the same, nothing out of place. The vent in the living room was secure, no signs of anything being disturbed. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Then finally I laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh. I had freaked out over nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. The air still felt off, stagnant, heavy, like someone had been breathing in it all night. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to ignore the irrational feeling that someone was watching me. That night I locked my bedroom door. I had never done that before, but something told me I needed to. I told myself it was just to help me sleep better. Around 3 a.m. I woke up to a sound. A long, slow creak. My closet door. I wasn't imagining it this time. I could hear it moving. I went back the next morning, convinced I'd overreacted. Maybe it really was just a trick of the light. Maybe I'd let my nerves get the best of me. That's what I told myself as I unlocked my door, heart pounding in my chest. The apartment looked the same, nothing out of place. The vent in the living room was secure, no signs of anything being disturbed. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Then finally I laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh. I had freaked out over nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. The air still felt off, stagnant, heavy, like someone had been breathing in it all night. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to ignore the irrational feeling that someone was watching me. That night I locked my bedroom door. I had never done that before, but something told me I needed to. I told myself it was just to help me sleep better. Around 3 a.m. I woke up to a sound. A long, slow creak. My closet door. I wasn't imagining it this time. I could hear it moving. I lay frozen in bed, my body stiff with terror as I listened. My breath was shallow, barely daring to move. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself that maybe I had left a window open, that a draft had pushed it slightly. But my brain kept screaming, "You locked the windows. You locked everything." The door creaked again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. I had to look. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet. The door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but it had been closed when I went to bed. My stomach turned, my pulse pounded in my ears, and I gripped the sheets so tightly my fingers ached. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Then I heard it. A faint, barely audible shuffling sound, coming from inside the closet. It wasn't loud, just the softest movement, like fabric brushing against something. It could have been the building settling, I told myself. Could have been anything. But then, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Breathing. It was faint, slow, controlled, but it was there. Someone was in my closet, hiding, watching me. I nearly screamed, but I clamped my hand over my mouth just in time. I forced myself to stay quiet, my body shaking as I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I tried to unlock it, my mind racing with 1,000 panicked thoughts. And then the breathing stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. Like whoever or whatever was inside had realized I was awake. I stopped moving, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. I listened. Nothing. For a full minute, maybe two, I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just listened. And then, from inside the closet, tap, tap, tap. I lost it. I shot up, bolting out of bed so fast that I nearly tripped over my own feet. I fumbled for the doorknob, yanking it open and sprinting down the hall. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran straight out of my apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my fingers still clenched around my phone. I wasn't thinking anymore. I just dialed 911. I could barely get the words out. My voice shook so badly that the operator had to ask me to repeat myself 3 times before she understood me. Someone's in my apartment. The cops showed up fast. I guess my panic must have made them take me seriously this time, because 2 officers were already pulling into the lot within minutes. I stood there, shivering in the cold, my arms wrapped around myself as they went inside. I expected them to come back out within minutes, saying they'd found nothing, that I was imagining things. That's what I had prepared myself for. But they didn't. They were inside for a long time, longer than I expected. And when they finally came out, the look on the older officer's face made my stomach drop. "You said you live alone?" he asked. I nodded, my throat dry. He glanced at his partner before turning back to me. "We found something." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The officer hesitated, then gestured for me to follow. My legs felt like lead as I stepped forward, my entire body numb with fear. They led me back up to my apartment. The door was still open, the hallway light spilling into the darkness. I could barely bring myself to step inside. The younger officer pointed to the hallway vent. It was open. The screws had been completely removed, the grate pulled away. And next to it, sitting just outside the vent, was a small pile of objects. My missing house keys, a half-empty water bottle, a candy wrapper I didn't recognize. But the worst part? A t-shirt. A men's t-shirt. Worn, dirty, not mine. I felt sick. The officer's voice was low when he spoke again. "We checked the ducts." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know. But he told me anyway. "The vents are big enough for someone to crawl through. We found signs that someone's been living in there." I must have swayed because the younger officer reached out, steadying me. "Do you know anyone who might have access to your apartment?" the older cop asked. I shook my head. I had no idea who could have been inside. But deep down, something inside me already knew. Whoever it was, they'd been watching me, listening, living inside my walls. The cops didn't find him that night, but that meant one thing. He was still out there, somewhere, and I had no idea for when he was coming back. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. The police had searched every inch of my apartment, but their search had one major flaw: they didn't find him. And if they didn't find him, that meant he could be anywhere. I spent the night at my friend Megan's place. She was the only person I felt comfortable calling that late, though even as I stood in her doorway, shivering, my hands still shaking from adrenaline, I could tell she thought I was overreacting. "You're sure it wasn't just some squatter who got in once and left?" she asked, handing me a blanket. I barely even heard her. I was too busy checking the vents in her apartment, my paranoia now inescapable. "I'm not staying there," I muttered. Megan sighed. "Look, I get it. It's terrifying. But the cops didn't find anyone. Maybe he got scared and left when he realized you called them." I really did, but something in my gut told me she was wrong. Megan let me crash on her couch. I didn't sleep. Every single noise made my skin crawl. Every creak of the apartment above, every distant hum of the air vents kicking on. I flinched at everything. I couldn't stop thinking about the shirt. It had been dirty, crumpled, like it had been worn recently. That meant the person in my vents wasn't just hiding there. They were living there. How long? How long had they been inside my walls? Had they been there since I moved in? Since the day I brought my things inside and thought I was alone? Had they been watching me sleep? I could have thrown up just thinking about it. The next morning, I called my landlord. I didn't even let her talk before I launched into my story, my voice shaking as I demanded she change my locks. She sighed heavily, like I was being dramatic. "The police already checked and they didn't find anything. You said it yourself. There was someone in my vents. Then they're gone now, aren't they?" She refused to take me seriously. I don't know if she thought I was lying or just trying to get out of my lease, but by the end of the conversation it was clear she wasn't going to do a damn thing. That's when I knew. I had to get out of that apartment. I started looking for a new place that same day. I didn't care about breaking my lease. I didn't care about losing my security deposit. I just needed out. That night, I went back to my apartment for the first time since calling the police. Megan came with me honestly. I don't think I would have gone alone. Walking in felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like stepping into a place I didn't belong anymore. I had only come to grab my essentials clothes, toiletries, my work laptop. I wasn't planning to stay. I kept my movements quick, stuffing things into bags as fast as I could. I refused to look at the vents. Then Megan asked, "Did you leave that open?" I turned. She was staring at my bedroom closet. The door was open, only a few inches just like before. My stomach dropped. I had locked it before I left. I knew I had. My fingers clenched around the strap of my bag. "We're leaving." Megan looked at me, eyes widening. "Don't you want to check?" "Number." I grabbed my bags and practically shoved her out the door. I didn't even bother locking it behind me. I didn't care anymore. We got back to her place, and Megan finally stopped arguing with me. I think, for the first time, she actually believed me. I spent the next few days looking for a new apartment. I didn't go back, not even to pack more things. I just left. Then, 4 days later, I got a call from my landlord. "You're moving out?" she asked. "Yeah," I said flatly. She let out an annoyed sigh. "You could have at least told me instead of abandoning your unit." I didn't respond. She was quiet for a moment. Then her tone shifted. "Well, I'm glad you weren't there last night." My breath caught. "Why?" There was another pause. Then finally she spoke. "The downstairs neighbor called the cops. She heard noises coming from your apartment." My throat went dry. She said it sounded like someone moving around. I felt like I was going to be sick. "She thought maybe you had come back, but when the cops got there, they found the place empty." "What are you saying?" Another pause. "When they checked, the front door was locked," she said. "But the vent in your living room was open." I couldn't breathe. "They think whoever it was came back." I felt dizzy. My ears were ringing. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "They also found something in your closet." Eyes. "What?" Another beat of silence. "A blanket and some empty water bottles." My pulse stopped, like someone had been sleeping there. I hung up the phone. I sat there, staring at the floor, my hands trembling so violently that my entire body shook with them. The reality of it hit me all at once. I never went back to that apartment, not even once. I didn't care about my furniture, my security deposit, or the things I left behind. Nothing was worth stepping foot in that place again, knowing what had been inside with me. At first, I tried to convince myself that moving away would fix things, that once I was in a new apartment, a new city, a new life, I'd feel safe again. But I didn't. I moved in with Megan for a while, trying to get my footing. She did her best to make me feel comfortable, but I could tell she was worried about me. I wasn't sleeping. I barely ate. Every night, I lay awake in the darkness, my ears tuned to the silence, my eyes locked on the air vent across the room. I knew it was empty. I had checked it 100 times. But that didn't stop me from imagining him in there, waiting, watching, breathing. I couldn't take it anymore. A week after I left the apartment for good, I went to the police station. I didn't know what I expected, I just wanted answers. I wanted to know if they had found him. The officer at the front desk recognized me immediately. I could tell by the way his face shifted, his polite expression faltering for just a second before he forced it back into place. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, "you're the one, from the apartment?" "Yes." My voice came out hoarse. I hadn't spoken much in days. He nodded and glanced at his computer, typing something in. I watched his eyes scan the screen. Then, slowly, he looked back up at me. "There was an investigation," he said carefully. "But the suspect hasn't been identified." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled through his nose, clearly choosing his words. "We found evidence that someone had been living in the vents, but we have no leads on who they were." I felt a sickening wave of nausea. "So, he's still out there?" The officer hesitated. "We don't have any reason to believe he's still in the building. He could have been a transient someone, using the ventilation system to move between units. He may have left once he realized the police were involved." I wanted to believe that, but something inside me knew it wasn't that simple. Still, the conversation ended there. No suspect, no arrest, no closure. I went back to Megan's that night and sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. My body wouldn't stop shaking. If they hadn't found him, if they hadn't identified him, that meant he was still out there. I tried to move on. I finally found a new place, a small studio in a newer building, with sealed air vents and no crawl spaces. The very first thing I did before signing the lease was inspect every wall, every corner, every possible hiding space. Still, the paranoia followed me. For months, I checked my closets every single night before bed. I lined the vents with furniture, even though I knew there was no space behind them for anyone to hide. I didn't sleep well, ever. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my fear control me. But some fears aren't irrational. Some fears are born from reality. 6 months later, I got a call from a different police department. It was early, too early, the kind of call that immediately makes your stomach drop before you even answer. The voice on the other end was serious. "Is this my name?" I sat up in bed, gripping my phone. "Yes?" The next sentence made my blood run cold. "We have a man in custody. We believe he may be connected to your case." I sat there silent. My brain couldn't process what I had just heard. The officer continued, "Do you have time to come in for a statement?" I don't remember responding. I don't remember getting dressed. I just remember sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room, shaking so badly that I could barely hold the cup of coffee they handed me. "We arrested him last night," the detective told me. "Caught him trying to break into an apartment across town." I swallowed hard. "He's been doing this for a while," the detective continued. "Moving from place to place, living inside buildings without being noticed." My voice came out in a whisper. "Who is he?" The detective slid a mugshot across the table. I forced myself to look. The man in the photo was young, mid-30s maybe, thin, almost sickly looking, with sunken eyes and messy, unkempt hair. Not a monster, not a deformed, shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Just a man. Oh, that made it worse. He's been doing this for years, the detective said grimly. We found evidence that he had been living in multiple apartments across the city, sometimes for months at a time. I felt my stomach lurch. How did he get inside? The detective's expression darkened. Through the vents, just like in your case. I wanted to throw up. He admitted to watching people, the detective continued. He never interacted, never made contact, but he listened. I couldn't breathe. He said he liked the feeling of being there, without them knowing. I shot up from my seat, my chair scraping against the floor. I need to leave. The detective didn't stop me. He just nodded. I understand. That was a year ago. He's in prison now. That should make me feel safe. It should make me feel like I can finally breathe again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I still hear it. The soft scratching sound, the faint shuffling. Sometimes I wake up and feel like I'm being watched. Like there's something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I check the vents every night, even though I know I don't have to. Even though I know he's locked away. Because the truth is, I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. Not completely. Because for a long time, I had never been alone. I had just thought I was. And that's what haunts me the most. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where porch lights flicked on at dusk and kids played outside until their parents called them in for dinner. It was safe. At least, that's what we thought. We had a large backyard, separated from our neighbors by an old wooden fence. Beyond the fence was a dense stretch of trees, too small to be called a forest, but thick enough to feel isolated. As kids, my brother and I would dare each other to run into the woods at night, but we never made it more than a few steps before chickening out. Our house had a small back porch with a single bulb that cast just enough light to reach the edge of the yard. I never thought much about it, until the night I saw him. It was early autumn, I remember, because the leaves had just begun to turn and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell. I was 14 at the time, up late doing homework. My bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and out of habit, I glanced outside. That's when I saw movement near the fence. At first I thought it was an animal, a stray dog, or maybe a deer. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, my stomach tightened. Someone was standing just beyond the fence, deep in the shadows of the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt an icy wave of dread creep up my spine. The figure was tall, its body partially obscured by the branches. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, but I knew I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a tree swaying in the breeze. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. There was a man standing in my backyard. I slowly backed away from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to take my eyes off him, afraid that if I looked away, he'd suddenly be closer. I forced myself to turn and ran straight to my parents' room. My dad grumbled as I shook him awake, but the moment I told him someone was in the yard, he was out of bed in an instant. He grabbed a baseball bat he kept by the door and stormed onto the back porch, flicking on the light. The yard was empty. No footprints in the grass. No broken branches. Nothing. My parents assured me it was my imagination, that I had been staring at my homework too long, eyes playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw, and that was only the beginning. The next few nights I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there again. And then, on the third night, I did. This time he was closer, standing just inside the yard. I could see him more clearly now. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothing. His face was turned slightly downward, as if he was staring at the ground. I wanted to scream. to run, but my body wouldn't move. And then, he took a step forward. The movement snapped me out of my frozen state. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over my chair as I bolted for my parents' room. Again, my dad ran outside, but the man was gone. At this point, my parents were worried, but still skeptical. Maybe it was a neighbor passing through, maybe some teenager messing around. Then, a few nights later, something happened that made them believe me. It was around midnight. My mom had gotten up to get a glass of water. She happened to glance outside and saw the back porch light flicker on. She froze. The light was motion activated. Something had set it off. She nudged my dad awake and he crept toward the window. That's when they saw him. The man was standing at the base of the porch steps, not at the fence, not by the trees, right up against the house. My mom gasped. The sound must have carried because the man snapped his head upward, looking directly at the window. Then he bolted. My dad threw open the door, but the man had already disappeared into the trees. The police were called. They searched the yard, the woods, even went knocking on our neighbors' doors. No one had seen anything. But the worst part, the back gate was unlocked. We always kept it locked. Always. But that night, it had been unlatched from the inside, as if someone had been inside our yard. The police patrolled the area for a few days, but nothing turned up. And just like that, the man was gone. Or so we thought. Weeks passed. Then months. The weather turned colder, the days shorter, and little by little I started to feel safe again, until the morning we found the footprints. My dad was raking leaves when he noticed them. Deep impressions in the frost-covered grass, leading from the back fence all the way to my bedroom window. Not just once, over and over, like someone had been coming back, night after night, standing outside my window, watching. That was the last straw. My parents installed cameras, replaced the fence, put in floodlights. The police were called again, but there were no suspects, no leads. Whoever he was careful, and just like that, the footprints stopped. We never saw the man again. Years passed. We moved away. My parents never liked talking about what happened, brushing it off as a drifter passing through. But I knew better. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel it. That heavy, sinking dread, that unnerving certainty that someone is watching. And the worst part? Sometimes I still wake up to my porch light flickering on, even when no one is there.